Alright, today I'll be discussing a little bit about the HUBzero development roadmap. And we'll be discussing primarily what we're calling 2.2 and a little bit about the version even beyond that, or what we'll just call 2.3 for now. I'm sure people will probably have questions as we go along. I would say hold questions until I at least go through the list of features, and I can go into details on anything afterwards. And for people that kind of want to follow along here, if you actually go to help.hubzero.org/documentation/roadmap, you should hopefully be able to see a lot of the features, or the list of all the features that I'll be talking about here. I'll probably be adding items to this list as we go on in the next couple weeks, or even reformatting the list just to organize data. But for the most part, this is kind of set on what is coming up. So we can just kind of jump right into it here. And the biggest change to keep in mind, at least in terms of developers, in fact most of this will be directed at sort of developers or people doing development on the HUBzero platform. The biggest change is going to be that the new minimum PHP requirement will be 5.6. For the most part, there's not a whole lot you have to do to upgrade PHP code from 5.4 to 5.6. In fact, there's very, very little you would have to do. The one thing to keep in mind will probably be if you're using direct PHP MySQL calls, like MySQL offset rows or something like that. I believe all the MySQL calls like that are deprecated, and you have to change it to MySQLi. That's probably the biggest change, that if there is anyone that did any development. Going a little beyond that, we're actually trying to ensure that the entire HUBzero codebase is actually PHP7 ready for 2.2. PHP7 won't be the requirement for 2.2, but we're making sure that at least our code is compatible. We're kind of thinking further down the line here. Let's see, the next items, the CMS config file type will probably be changing from PHP to JSON, JSON or YAML, most likely JSON. This really shouldn't affect anyone, but the reason why we're making the change is that there are scripts and code outside of the CMS that isn't PHP, such as like the tool middleware and some of that stuff, that needs to look at the configuration information for the CMS. And having a more universal file type like JSON or YAML makes it far easier for those scripts to do. So that should be a pretty seamless change. In fact, no one should actually have to do anything for it to happen. We'll have migrations and code in there to just kind of seamlessly handle that switch over. But more of a FYI for people who are paying attention here. Alright, and then we start diving into a whole bunch of kind of development sort of items here, just to try to make development life a little easier. First off is that we have added the ability so that migrations can now be read out of the actual extension directory for each extension, such as components, plugins, modules. If they have their own migrations, that migrations directory can exist inside of that extensions directory. So like components com blog/migrations. So you no longer have to move them out into app migrations. Keeps everything a little more organized, kind of all in the same spot. And that's true for components, modules, plugins, and templates. The next kind of big piece here is we do now support unprefixed component and module directory names. So that means if you have app components I'll use blog again here. It could just be app components blog instead of com_blog. And for the version after 2.2, all of HUBzero's code will follow that pattern. So this is kind of setting the stage and just kind of an FYI. So that once you upgrade to 2.2, start converting your code, because the next version 2.3 prefixed directories will no longer be supported. And once you do actually have a directory that does not have the prefix on it, and it's namespace following the standard conventions that you'll see throughout most HUBzero extensions, you all get autoloading with that. That means you no longer have to have include or require statements in your code. As long as it's properly namespaced and follows that same follows the same directory structure, it'll just get loaded in. And then one of the nice things that I've been working on is trying to have automatic API endpoints. What this means is, if you have a component that has ORM models in it, again, I'll use the blog as an example, just because it's a simple example. You don't actually have to have or write any API code, and you automatically get API entries for those models. So if I have blog models and then entry to represent, database table of entries, I can go to API/blog/entries, and I automatically get all the basic create, read, update, delete endpoints for that model. Now, that only happens if you don't have an API endpoint implemented for your component already. So you can implement API endpoints however you like. If you want to have a little more fine-grained control over inputs, outputs, and so on, or add extra features. But right out of the box, if you don't have an API endpoint, it'll just auto-generate them for you based off of whatever models you have. And we're trying to do a little bit of that same kind of work on the administrative side, just to kind of reduce a lot of the duplicated code. Because for the admin interface, we found that your basic actions, list, edit, save, delete, are kind of all mostly the same component to component. It's very rare that you really need to have some custom stuff in there. Let's see, moving down the list, there will be a change to some of the core HUBzero database connection information. Really, no one should notice any change at all. What we're doing right now is that the ORM models maintain a reference to the HUBzero database connection object. And I'm changing it so that instead of a singular object, the HUBzero database, like app get DB, will actually be a database registry, a database manager, so that it can maintain or manage multiple connections and of different connection types. And then in the model, you just have a name for which connection you want to use. This means that you can actually have mixed database connections in a component, multiple database connections, or for example, if you wanted a component to use a local SQLite database rather than the primary CMS's MySQL database, you can do that. So there's some kind of interesting setup and features that kind of come along with that. And there will be built-in database drivers for MySQL, SQLite, and Postgres. And then there's just a generic PDO database driver if you want to set up the connection information a little more unique or very fine on how you want to set it up. Let's see, the next item, some of the Joomla constants like Jpath component, Jpath component site, Jpath component administrator will be deprecated. They will be going away. Jpath component will be replaced with just path component, but none of the other two will exist. So if you're using those constants, make sure to change your code. Generally, if you need the path up to a specific component, usually we tell you to use the component path helper. I can provide more details on that if anyone has questions. We're also, on that note, putting out a note that Joomla will be end of life as of the version after 2.2. We've been pushing heavily towards getting the remaining Joomla code out of there. In fact, that's a lot of what 2.2 has in it, is I rewrote a number of components to remove all of the remaining Joomla code. And there'll still be a couple items that we'll be doing the last conversion on in 2.2, but as of 2.3, the version afterwards, all remaining Joomla code will be removed. So if you have anything that's using any Joomla based code, J whatever, JTable, J anything, that will be gone as of 2.3. Let's see. Let's see. I already mentioned we added migration directories to every component. We did add base migrations to every component as well, so those can kind of do the base installs, uninstalls, and so on. The goal here is that eventually to install the base database tables you need for a HUBzero install, rather than say CMS script looking up the install.sql file or anything like that. You can just run migrations and it'll run down through all the available extensions and do whatever it needs to do to install the base tables and base data you need. So that's kind of the direction we're moving there. One feature that was added is for search results. If you get back no results, it'll now suggest alternatives for the phrase or keywords you used. And we're trying to make a lot of improvements to search. We do have a lot of work going on right now to try to make adding data to the search ingester, Solar's ingester, more dynamic, more kind of automatic. It'll just happen as you add a new component or something like that. Let's see. Going down the list, we will be removing some extensions. Com admin will be removed. This is just an old carryover component from com Joomla. It wasn't actually even being used. Most people probably didn't even know it was still there, so no harm there. Com store and com services, which is used by com store, will be removed. The only component, or not component, the only hub that's using that one is NanoHub at the moment. And we do have com store front already in the core, so it's kind of redundant functionality, so we're just removing the old functionality that no one's even using at the moment. Com feed aggregator, which I believe is currently only being used by one of our hubs, and if there is any component that's being used by a specific hub, we will add it to the app directory or make it available so that people can add it to their app directory, but it will be removed from the base HUBzero core install. There's a couple carryover plugins, quick icon that were carryovers from Joomla stuff not being used. Those have been removed, as well as some placeholder Xmessage plugins that have been there for years, never been used, so I'm just removing them from the core. And then some old templates that will no longer be supported, such as HubBasic 2012 and 2013. Those will get removed as well. The only core templates we'll have in there will be the Chimera and Chameleon, Chameleon being the admin template. We will be adding an activity component so that you'll actually be able to see the activity on the site. Hopefully we can use that. It also provides API endpoints, and hopefully we can use that to kind of provide some interesting statistics, or sort of a kind of a dashboard of interesting activity that's going on your hub. So you could see, you know, how much is actual content creation versus, you know, content being edited, deleted, and all that kind of fun stuff that we can kind of start slicing and dicing the data with. And then there's just a list of components that have been rewritten to use the ORM models. Mostly that was to get rid of old Joomla code. I can go through that list if people really want to know, but for the most part, it shouldn't really affect anyone. It's just a lot of kind of internal house cleaning stuff. Moving on, like I said, to 2.3, that's where the PHP7 will come into play. We're pushing pretty heavily for that to happen. PHP7 will be the minimum requirement for 2.3. The goal here is that 2.2 should hopefully be a relatively short-lived release, maybe 4 to 6 months. I say that now, we'll see what happens when, as we get moving along here. But that's kind of the goal, because we're strongly pushing for PHP7 and hopefully getting MySQL upgraded as well. We have a little more work to do there. We have some issues with date time fields and having default values we need to get straightened out. But we're pushing for hopefully MySQL 5.6 and above as well. As I mentioned, for 2.3, the prefixed components, comma underscore, mod underscore will get removed. We'll remove the prefixes. Prefixes will no longer be supported. We're also finally changed the default language from English Great Britain to English US, which I should have done a couple years ago and just didn't get around to. And we're potentially looking at changing the manifest files. This is the top level XML file you see in every extension. Components, modules, plugins, templates, there's some kind of whatever .xml file there. And we're thinking about changing that potentially to JSON. In fact, it might become a composer.json file. And the reason being is that we're doing a lot of work right now figuring out ways that when we have hubs that have their own groups of developers, that they can manage their code and push to production on their own schedule without having to wait for us on our monthly releases and so on. So we're doing a lot of work here on figuring that out, and it looks like Composer will potentially be a pretty heavy player in that. And we're kind of testing it now. We'll be testing it up through December and hopefully rolling it out with at least one of our hubs in January. If all looks like it's going really well, we will roll that out to all of our hubs. And it looks like, again, Composer will be pretty involved in that. And for the most part, for people who don't know what Composer is, it's kind of a PHP libraries package manager kind of thing. You just have a JSON file, you say, I want this version of this code, and point it to a specific repo on like GitHub or something like that, and it'll just pull in that particular code and so on. You can also set it up so that each package can actually say what its dependencies are, what its requirements are. So if you had a package that explicitly required PHP7, you could say that, and it wouldn't even allow you to install that code on your hub if your hub wasn't running PHP7. Or you can also say, if I'm installing this component, I also need these 3 plugins kind of thing, and it'll automatically download and install that code as well. So there's a lot of really interesting and fun things we can do there that'll make managing dependencies a lot easier, hopefully. And again, allow groups that have their own developers to manage their own code and their own release schedule a lot easier without having to rely on us to do it. So that's kind of a whirlwind overview of a lot of the changes that are kind of coming up here. And I'm sure people probably have questions, so we can just kind of dive right into that here. Sorry, I'm pulling up the chat here. Such a tiny window. Come on. There we go. All right, no questions?
So here's one. If we have some custom modules, I guess we'll be encouraged to try to make the adaptations ourselves, or maybe we can get you all to help us to sort of hew to the new standards.
Either one. Hopefully, I mean, the goal is to always try to get the documentation up to a spec that you can actually make those transitions yourself. But if that was something you want us to help with, we're certainly available.
Sure. I mean, you've done a nice job laying out exactly what you're going to do, so I don't anticipate it should be terrible. But so and I like the the composer style dependency management. Sounds great. That's really cool.
Yeah. Some of the other things I forgot to mention that we've also been working on is trying to get new and better. What's the word here? Like Docker development kind of environments and things like that, so that
Sure.
standing up a dev hub and stuff is just a lot easier if you just want to play around with code and so on.
That is going to be really welcome from my point of view. Thanks. I'll be interested to hear more about that as it develops.
Any other questions? Yeah. Oh wait, supported OSs. So Peach. Sorry, I'm reading from the chat here. Will we have a new minimum requirements for supported OSs so that PHP 5.6 can be pulled in from standard repos? Potentially. That's a good question. I'll look that one up. But yes, some OS requirements might have to change just to support that. Yes. We'll try to get a more definitive list on what the end OS requirements will actually look like here.
But nominally, you'll still have Debian and Red Hat.
I believe so. Yes.
Good.
Any other questions? All right. Well, I'll give people time to think of something here. One of the other things I wanted to briefly talk about is that we're also pushing on I guess a direction here, or a path to try to reduce redundancy overall within a lot of the extensions and code that we have. For instance, sometimes it's hard to tell what really the difference, or why should I use this over that. You go into groups, for example, you have group pages and you also have group wikis. So there's a lot of areas where the Venn diagrams kind of overlap quite a bit. So we're putting a pretty strong push to try to reduce that overlap and make things clearer. So you might see some extensions go away, but only if there's already something else that will readily replace it. One other example might be the knowledge base component, ComKB. It's articles and categories. Well, there's already an articles and categories manager. That's the content manager. So it's kind of redundant. And if something like that ever does go away, we will try to make sure any data gets migrated or pushed into the correct places. Like right now, I'm working on a migration that will move the knowledge base article data into the standard content manager. So you won't lose any data. All the URLs will still be preserved. We're just reducing kind of the places where you can find all of the content and try to make it a little more centralized and easier. Right? Wow, really? No questions? Just kind of stunned you all? Trying to recover from your heart attacks? Oh my god, they're changing so much. Alright, well, we'll give it a couple minutes here just in case anyone has suddenly thinks of something, and then we could call it a day after that. Obviously, you're always free to contact us if you do have any more questions. And like I said, I'll try to keep that, we'll try to keep that roadmap page updated. In fact, I'll probably create a link to it in the main menu under documentation. I know the roadmap's been kind of a long-standing request, and part of that is just keeping it updated ourselves. So we will try to be more on top of that, and we'll just keep adding to it as we kind of go down. The 2.2 release, 2.2 it's scheduled to be released in January, beginning of January. In fact, we'll be spending the entire month of December just doing testing. So we're going to try to pound on it pretty hard, fingers crossed. And that should be January. I would prefer that the 2.2 release is only about 4 to 6 months before the 2.3 will get released. There's no firm date on 2.3 right now, but it should be in the spring. Let's see, any changes to the UX or most of the changes under the hood? Most of the changes are under the hood for the moment. A lot of this is setting the stage for potential changes down the road for how we would like to take the UI user experience. So it's a lot of prep work for it, which will probably happen once 2.3 comes along. And for those curious about what that kind of prep work might be, we've been pushing pretty heavily on trying to go more API centric, so that then once the data and once you can do a lot of things through the API, then the website interface is just one potential interface to that data. We would like more things to use the API, and it opens up the possibility if you had a pretty JavaScript heavy front end, you could do things like Electron apps and so on, which if you're not curious, go look up or research Electron apps, and they're pretty cool. Let me catch up here. Suddenly there's all kinds of questions. Merging of groups and projects coming in 2.3? Possibly. I would like to actually start working in that direction. I have ideas on how we could actually merge the two, but still maintain sort of a groups with sub-teams or subgroups kind of thing, sub-workspace areas. Whatever the terminology we'll end up using, we might even keep the same words, but maybe we'll change them just so people don't get confused by the old versus the new. Yeah, there's a lot of similarity between the two right now, and we would like to kind of get that a little more fleshed out and maybe make them work, I want to say a little more seamlessly together. So we'll try to keep people posted on that. I have a number of ideas and kind of things I want to do here, but again, it is at the moment turning into just how much we can get done in a certain time frame. And can you talk about implemented package AWS or other VM platforms and even Vagrant for development? Well, for one, for our own, I would say internal stuff, we've been actually looking at sort of doing a lot of, I want to say, continuous deployment kind of sort of cycles and pipelines there if we can. I know Eric had actually been doing some research into that. So that would be kind of nice if we could get some of that rolling out. It would be nice if we were doing that, it would automatically create packages or builds. There you could go download whatever the weekly build is, for HUBzero or something like that, instead of having to wait on us to make new packages every month or however often we do it. Vagrant or I keep losing the word for the other one. Docker, Vagrant or Docker environments. Yes, we've been working on those as well, trying to make some nice, fairly nicely set up environments, possibly in two different flavors, one with the CMS, one with just the CMS and one with CMS and tools, since that one's a little heavier and a little more involved. But just the CMS is, if you just want to get up and want to start writing components or modules or something, that should actually be pretty easy. In fact, a couple weeks ago I threw together one that had the CMS with PHP7 in it, just to test and play around with things, and that wasn't too terrible to get up and running, but we want to make sure we can provide those where they're sort of optimized with all the proper libraries and settings. And yes, I would like to get those shared and posted, hopefully on our HUBzero GitHub, so then you could just download that Docker file and off you go, or Docker Compose and so on. Some good questions here. And yes, we are trying to make, as you can probably tell, a lot of this is just trying to make getting development and getting a hub stood up a lot easier and faster. Even for our own internal sanity, we get new developers on or something like that, setting up a development box, we want to be, almost as quick as just pressing a button kind of thing. All right, any more questions or? No? All right, I guess we'll call it there, and thank you everyone for joining. Some good questions there, and if something does occur to you, feel free to just put in a ticket or put in a ticket or email me if you know my email address, which I believe everyone probably does at this point. And we'll try to get them answered and get the actual roadmap updated, maybe with a little more info. If something wasn't quite clear, we'll try to fill in details as we can and provide code samples and so on. For the documentation, I did actually link out to what the changes were in PHP, like PHP 5.6 or PHP 7, so you can read PHP's documentation on what you might need to do to upgrade. And good luck.